You said you live your adult life either as a reflection of your childhood or in reaction to it. What do you mean when you say that? Are we all sort of acting out of some place from our childhood every single day, even to this day?
There is some echo from your childhood playing out there. And it's not always obvious because, your childhood isn't necessarily what you remember. It's a lot of what you forget, whether you're a parent or not. You have to know that you had experiences in your childhood that you attached to various incidents, and you live like it's about the incidents, and it's not. It's about the experience that came out of it. You are the generational chain. Everything that falls out of your mouth, you are the generational chain. And if you want to break anything, it starts with you. What we fail to see is the mechanism that runs underneath those circumstances from that generation to this generation. You're not working on the chain, you're working on the oil. You're making no effort at the chain. People can get through really turbulent times in their childhood and come out with a whole different thing than somebody who went through a very similar experience, because they don't come out of the experience. What they come out with is whatever they told themselves about it. So if your children can have the ability to love, if your children have the ability to forgive and pivot and move, and if your children have the ability to no longer honor their negative feelings, to actually stay true to something else called their personal integrity, I would say they're pretty much equipped for anything that life might throw at them.
Bro, that is unbelievably well said. Hey, it's Ed Mylett. I just wanted to thank you for being here, and I would ask you to please subscribe to the show. If you just click the subscribe button here, I would really appreciate it. It helps the show grow so we can get even more successful guests on the program to help you. At the same time, if you're subscribed, you're going to get access to the programs before anybody else in the world gets access to them. So if you would, click subscribe right here. Thanks so much. All right, welcome back to the show, everybody. My guest today is somebody whose work I have been a fan of for years, and I have wanted to meet him. One of the great things about this show is I've met most of the people whose work has made the biggest impact on my life, and I got to tell you, this man's at the top of my list. His work hits you right between the eyes, and I would categorize it as brilliant. I just think the way he phrases things and comes right at you with truth is very unique, and he's also been on the list of most requested guests for quite a while. The book that first impacted me was Un-F Yourself. I'll give you the clean version. And the book that he has out right now is Grow Up, Becoming the Parent Your Kids Deserve. And as I read this book, it wasn't just really about being a parent. It was actually really about being a human being, which makes you a better parent. So that if you're not a parent and you're listening to this, trust me, every minute of this will apply to you. And if you are a parent, there'll just be an added bonus because this man's work will impact how you're raising your children. Gary John Bishop, welcome to the show, brother.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you, brother. It's good to have you too. So I read your stuff and I'm like, I got to read that again. Crap. It's like, it hits you, right? Mm-hmm. And I want to start out kind of, because it leads to the parenting thing, even though I think the vast majority of it just applies to being human and not just being a parent, being a functional person. You said you live your adult life either as a reflection of your childhood or in reaction to it. I just think that's really a great place to start. What do you mean when you say that? I know what it means for me, but are we all sort of acting out of some place from our childhood every single day, even to this day?
Yeah, I mean, if you were to look in any area of your life that doesn't work, there is some echo from your childhood playing out there. And it's not always obvious because, your childhood isn't necessarily what you remember. It's a lot of what you forget. And so you're shaped by it in ways that are, when you start to dig into it, become really surprising. And I think that's the fascinating part of it, at least for me.
How'd that play out for you? I mean, I know you talked about this situation in the book. It struck me. I think you were 4 years old. And the fact that you remember this is compelling to me. But I think your parents were fighting. You're trying to get them to stop. And once you take it from there, I think this is just a good example of that.
Well, I think, look, if you ask your average person, tell me every moment of your life, they can't tell you. But they'll tell you some interesting bits. But, for years and years, I used to kind of grind away at me like, why why do people remember that part and not all those other parts? And it wasn't until I started to get more deeper into my own development that I started to see them like little milestones or incidents. And so that incident as a 4-year-old was fascinating to me. Like, I remember the feeling, I remember that experience, and in the book I describe it. And the feeling for me in that moment was I had no power. I couldn't change it. I was overcome with this. And you got to get, for a little 4-year-old, this is like wild, right? But my experience in that moment was like, I'm weak. I can't do it. I couldn't stop them from arguing or fighting. And that moment isn't just a moment for a child. It's like a sea change in their experience of themselves. I'd never experienced myself that way before. It was new. And then so those little things just sink into the background, and they become what you call ontological decisions. They become decisions that you've made now that you're going to have to now handle, because they sink into the background and basically become your truth, if you like. And that was certainly one of mine.
That notion of your truth. That's why, by the way, I always said, whether you have children or not, this is about being a functioning human to me. I've never read someone's work, I don't think, Gary, where the way you said it, I want to write down and remember it. Like I find myself wanting to quote you more than most people. And here's something you said about that very thing on the past. This will rock a lot of you. And by the way, I agree with you after I read the book. You said the past wins one way or the other. And then you went on to say at another point, you say, you are not shaped by the past itself. You're shaped by what you said about it. Meaning, to some extent, this past thing is a little bit of an illusion to some extent. Am I right about that? Because I totally, completely, in my 50s now, realized the profound truth in that.
Right. So, like this is why this book had to be written. Like I couldn't put my head on the pillow for another night with getting this book out there, because I keep hearing all this stuff about generational chains, and parents, oh, I'm going to break a generational chain, and I'm like, you are the generational chain. Everything that falls out of your mouth, you are the generational chain, and if you want to break anything, it starts with you. And so I wanted to people to see what we're trying to break with generational chains, if you like, is circumstances. So we're looking back at old circumstances and going, those circumstances are not going to happen again. What we fail to see is the mechanism that runs underneath those circumstances from that generation to this generation to the next generation. So you're not working on the chain, you're working on the oil. You're making no effort at the chain. The chain itself continues because, like, if you go back to that example I used in the book, when I was 4 years old, my parents had no sense that that's what was going on in my head. And I had no sense at 4 years old that I was making a life-changing decision, because we don't relate to ourselves at 4 that way. I'm playing with toys and I'm having a good time and I'm, doing all the things that a 4-year-old would do. But in that moment, that experience, boom, it hit me like a wall. And so as parents, this is what I wanted people to get from this book. Like you said, whether you're a parent or not, you have to know that that you had experiences in your childhood that you attached to various incidents, and you live like it's about the incidents, and it's not. It's about the experience that came out of it. It's the ontologic decision. It's whatever you decided, whatever you changed in that moment, that compounded and lives on with you as an adult. So we've got our eye on all the wrong things, and I wanted people to start to see, like, you have to look at your life, your childhood, your parents' life, their childhood. And if you have children, maybe you'll get a little insight onto what's actually going on with them, no matter how hard you think you might be trying to guide them another way.
I told you, everybody. I'm telling you, his work hits you. By the way, the way he writes, too, he doesn't let you escape you. Every time you try to escape you, this guy's pulling you back to you. And I love that. It's like there's just no BS to this. And so I want to stay right on this incident when you were 4, and this absolute truth that you're talking about. I always say it's not the events of our life that define us. It's the meaning we attach to the event. And one of the difficult things when we're a child is we don't have the emotional makeup or experiences to attach. We're not really choosing our meaning when we're capable. We're choosing the meaning when we're incapable. And so do you then recommend somebody question their past? I know that you do, but I'm going to let you answer it. Do they question the past, and then are you having them evaluate an incident and then try to attach a new meaning to it so that they behave differently in the current moment because they attach a different meaning to an event?
Well, what I'd like people to see is that your mechanism for adding to a situation exists to this day. Okay, so it still exists.
What's a mechanism mean to you? What do you mean by mechanism?
So it's like your automatic wiring.
Got it.
Your default is Heidegger, the German philosopher, he would have called it your default ways of being.
Okay.
So the ways that you are by default. And, people don't wake up in the morning and decide to be themselves. They wake up and that self is there.
Yes.
Right. And it's a set self. It's not a malleable self. It's like this me that I am. Now, if you hang around little ones long enough, especially like that age group, like 2, 3, 4, there's no real self there. It's just like this big expression, right? There's no set way. But anybody who's a parent will tell you they literally watch their children become set, right? They literally watch them like the age of 7, age of 12, age of 14, and then suddenly they're just like that way, and they're always that way. They're always, and they're always that way as a compensation to whatever they felt they had to overcome. That's why it's so testing, by the way, because, like people can get through really, really turbulent times in their childhood and come out with a whole different thing than somebody who went through a very similar experience. They come out with a whole different thing. Why? Because they don't come out of the experience. What they come out with is whatever they told themselves about it. Wow. So, and it becomes so tightly intertwined that whatever I told myself about it and the incident, there's no distinction between those two for me as a human being. They're the same thing, right? So again, for instance, in that moment, I'm 4 years old. I'm watching my parents argue. It's about me. I'm not observing that like this is about them. I'm observing that like this is about me. Like I came to some self-determination in that moment. What I want people to understand is if they look back in their own childhood, what do you think? Those were just random moments and nothing came out of it? No, you're the living embodiment of what you decided in those moments. And by the way, when you make that kind of decision, that's why those memories are so fresh, so clear. The rest of your life is about those little memories getting reactivated, those same emotions coming up and getting applied to situations. As I like to say, people live their lives in little vignettes of fighting the same battle over and over and over, and then they die.
Gary, you're on to such profound work here. As a friend, as a brother, I want to encourage you to continue to dig deeper into this, and that there's other books. I'm serious. I've done some work in this myself and started to write about it. And this is new and this is profound. And we'll talk about those 3 stages in a second. But it's why, by the way, a child can have the same exact 2 parents. One child takes different meanings from the situations they were raised in, and they have 2 totally different lives. I'm raised by an alcoholic father, and it ends up that all 4 of us turned out pretty darn okay. But usually, you'll see one of the children goes on to be a high performer, and the other one ends up being an alcoholic themselves. Same exact environment, same situations, different meanings were attached. And then
right.
that notion that you just said, brother, about that you're fighting the same battle over and over again with different circumstances, but the same battle. Listen to what he says in the book. I tell you guys, I don't ever quote books in interviews, Gary. I don't do this. But I want you to hear what he said here. Every day of your life, I wrote this down for me, bro, not for the interview. This is stuff for me, but I'm going to have it in the interview. Every day of your life, you find evidence for and then confirm in your crevices of your mind, quote, you. You talk like you, walk like you, think like you, and react like you. Every single day, You are justifying you. And one of the main ways you do it is by reaching back into your memories to satiate that beast. Therefore, the past isn't just the past, as evidence for you being the character that you've become to this day. The past wins one way or the other. Brother, are you serious? That is so good. I just want you to elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, look, when I say people are being self-indulgent, right, it sounds kind of narcissistic, which is another word I just can't stand. But anyway, but it sounds like it's just, like self-indulgent. What I mean is we indulge self. That is, we get up every day and we respond to what it wants, right? So we respond to its upsets, and we respond to its desires, and we respond to its quote unquote needs. So it's like, I really would invite people to get like, who you are is more like a venue for something to show up. And what shows up every day are the same noises, and you just go along with it. You fail to see that you're the venue in which all of this is happening. And with a little bit of like a shift, like just a little shift in the way you think, you could get a little bit more observant of that self, actually see what it wants to do and understand it in those terms. And I look at it more like it's just something I got to be responsible for rather than something I'm fighting against. Like either it's going to talk or I'm going to talk. And, I've heard all the shit that it wants to say, I'm bored by it now,
Stay on that. Man, bro, I got to tell you, it's one of these conversations I'll remember a long time. I often say, and if you don't mean it this way, correct me and say it your way. I often say just the awareness of the pattern of me being me, it loses a lot of its power over me when I'm just in awareness. Oh, I'm doing that thing again. I'm doing me again. I'm doing that thing I do. And what you said is then that former you, the way you just said that, is not the voice, that I can now choose the new voice. Is that what you mean by just stepping back and getting above yourself a little bit and going, oh, I'm doing that thing I do again. I'm being me again. That awareness allows you to then make a conscious choice as to how to behave or change rather than to keep responding unconsciously.
Right. So awareness isn't a stage that you arrive at, right? Awareness is a constantly unfolding phenomenon. Like as you're going through a day, you get aware of one default response and shift in that moment. I really believe, let's not believe this, I really want people to get this. In that moment, that shift that you make, you have literally changed the trajectory of your life in a moment.
Wow.
Right? Now, because your life would have kept going along that path and you just were like, nope, we're not doing that, right? So imagine being someone who manages, to catch yourself a handful of times a day, just catching yourself about to go in a direction that you typically do. And you're like, you know what? Not today. I'm not doing that. Now, when I wrote my first book, that was a 9-month, 10-month process of catching myself 30 times a day, because the self that I am had no interest in writing that book and had zero interest in you reading it, because, I'd be open to scrutiny and judgment and ridicule and la, 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 la. So the kind of self that I had become was going to make that a long process that eventually I would give up on and just say it's not worthwhile. And I would tell myself some nonsense like, I'm going to go in another direction. I see something else I think would be more powerful than writing a book. And all I did in that process was just catch. No, not today. I'm going to write. No, not today. I'm going to write. And I wouldn't call it necessarily a struggle, but it was definitely like, it was the first time I feel as if I'd really exercised that muscle and producing something that went beyond my wiring.
I relate very deeply to that, very deeply. And it's just the last 4 or 5 years for me that I've done that. One more thing on the past I want to cover, just because I want you to elaborate on it, because this stuff, to be honest with you today, guys, you're listening to a conversation between he and I that I wanted to have. And you said you are not a direct product of your past. And while it's true, you were thrown into an already existing conversation of family and values or morality, and so on. You are, in fact, a predictable, repetitive, emotional expression of what you have come to believe is true about all of that past. And no, what you have come to believe about it, this is not the same as actually what happened. So you have
Right.
Are you saying you have a flawed recollection of the past? Because this matters as a parent, because you're imprinting on your children all the time. It matters as a human being to then understand that imprinting that you are now reflexively, unconsciously living through now.
You have a terrible recollection of the past, like terrible. And I know a lot of people are like, oh no, I still remember the smell. Look, here's what neuroscience will tell you. Every time you recollect a memory, you don't recollect the memory. You recollect the last memory you had of that memory.
Yes.
And that's how your brain works. So now if you're someone in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, if you recollect a memory right now, you're recollecting a memory of 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 a memory all the way back. So all the times that you've recollected that memory, how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of times down the line you are?
Wow.
That's how far you are away from that memory. And again, if you use that example, when I was a 4-year-old, the memory isn't so much about the parents. The memory is more like, for me in that moment, it was, I'm weak. But just as easily, by the way, in that moment, a child might have said, my mother's weak or my father's weak, and set themselves on that pathway. Therefore, through the rest of that childhood, it's about gathering evidence for, see, there he or she goes again. There they are again. There they are again. There they are again. That's why when people, like you just gave an example earlier of a family of maybe 3 or 4, all have a different experience. And you shared that your father, you're an alcoholic father. And, I had one of those. I don't call him an alcoholic anymore, by the way. I call him, somebody who drank to the degree that he couldn't manage his life anymore. That's it, simple. Alcoholic's a whole world that I don't want to dwell in. But when I look at that childhood, you could get a child coming out of that childhood and saying, my father was selfish and I hated him. You'd have another child coming out of that family saying, I love my dad. Okay, so which one's the truth? Well, for the individual, they're both the truth, but they're not the truth.
Yes, that's right.
The truth is he did what he did, and that's it.
That's right.
What's added to all of that is what people have to live with.
Yep, guys, this is how you change your life, is these realizations. You're a accumulation of patterns, of behaviors and thoughts. And in order to change your life, it requires evaluation of those things. And the way that this is worded to me is the most profound. I have to tell you that for me, blame has been a major destroyer of my own life. And you write pretty hardcore about blame in the book. So once you have these memories, by the way, as a parent, this stuff matters. This thing he just said about repeating the memories, one thing I just want to say, that can happen at any age. I've had friends of mine that have gotten a divorce. We've all seen this before. You knew them when they were married. You knew them when they got divorced. And one of them has a repetitive version of their memory of a memory of a memory of a memory of a memory. And you see them 10 years later. And the other one has, then you have them get together and they go, I didn't do that. I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. And they both in their own world are right, except both of them are actually wrong. To your point is there was just a behavior that took place. So let's talk about blame. Whoa, boy, here we go. You say blame creates a sort of safety. Blame is a catalyst for keeping you tied to what has been. To blame is to perpetuate the past, to keep it going. And you're an effing blame machine. Ouch. So what do we do about that? And why does it matter?
I kind of hung out with that whole notion of blame for a number of years. Like it's a word that, by the way, as a culture now, it's a firestorm we're in when it comes to blame, right? So I know people have got a lot of ideas about, why society is the way that is. In my view, right, again, just some random Scottish guy, but in my view, the propensity for blame is wildly out of control, like wildly out of control. And we have fed that beast, by the way. We are feeding it and eating from the same trough. And so you cannot experience true freedom from the past and keep your blame. You can't. Now, again, I know people who say, well, oh, no, that's not true. I mean, I'm free of that incident and and I'll say, that's funny. Why are you bringing that up?
It's good.
And they're bringing it up because they have to continually remind themselves that they're over it or they're past it.
Yeah.
Now, I know this to be true. Not only, I'm not speaking from just personal experience. In fact, my personal experience really only aligns with what I've discovered in, years in coaching tens of thousands of people and going deep into the background of their lives. And when you go in there, you'll find the same undercurrent just running through it time after time after time. And how does it tie into the past? Well, it's quite as simple. If you had we talked about my experience when I was a 4-year-old. Imagine somebody else is a 7-year-old and their experience of an incident or 2 incidents or 4 incidents with their father is that he doesn't love me. He only cares about himself. That gets married. That goes through life, gets married, and has children. What gets married? I'm not loved, gets married. And I'm not loved, has children. And so what does it do? It does what I'm not loved would do. Prove that it's not loved. It's not the opposite. It's not like, let me surround myself with love. No, I'm going to diminish the way that people love me. I'm going to make it hard for people to love me. I'm going to prove that decision was true because I've developed some sort of persona or personality that allows me to grind up against it and prove it over time. So that blame actually has now become so embedded in me that I identify with a blame. And when I say I identify with it, I say the persona that I am identifies with that blame. Now, I've had people come to me and tell me, my life is miserable, this is terrible, my relationships don't work, and I'm coming with this, and I'll say, okay, well, let's look at who you're blaming. And we'll dive in there, and I'll say, yeah, you're blaming your father, you need to let him off the hook. And then they'll say no. They'll literally argue for their misery. And then what they'll do is, there's got to be another way. And I say, there is no other way. This is it. You're at the source of something here. And it's very, very testing for people. People fight for their misery. People fight for their right to hang on to their blame because they feel as if somehow letting go of that would maybe let somebody else off the hook. So they'd rather grind it out in their own toxicity than reach for freedom.
I think you hit on it at another part in the book. I want to ask you this. I think they feel like they're letting go a part of themselves when they do that. It's become such a familiar part of me, that thing you called you, this blame, this pattern, this belief, whether I've overcome it or I haven't. I think that holding on to that, letting it go, you feel like a sense of loss of who you believe you are. It's part of your identity. It's part of how you get through life. It's part of how you get the emotions. We move in our lives towards what we're most familiar with. And even if we have emotions that aren't healthy, we become addicted to them, and we're going to find a way on a damn daily or weekly basis to get those emotions one way or the other. And you are not going to tell me I don't get to get my crack. You actually call blame in the book crack. It's the crack of emotions. And I think you're on to something there, because I actually think we become addicted to these emotions even if they don't feel good anymore, because they're our version of crack, and we're not going to let go of them because then we lose part of ourself.
There are families that no longer exist because they couldn't settle on who was to blame. Period.
It's a shame. By the way, there are companies who no longer exist because in that company they couldn't figure out who was to blame. This addiction to blame, most things that end, you've nailed it in the book. You actually say something that I love because it helped it lose its power over me. You say, there is nothing remarkable about shame. It's almost like this badge of honor that we shame ourselves with. There's nothing remarkable about shame, nothing extraordinary about guilt, and absolutely zero personal power in blame. But then you actually take it a step further, and that includes blaming yourself.
Right.
There's a lot of us right now that come to the show today listening, and there's a little, we blamed a lot of, that's the addictive part. It's your fault. But political does that very well. No, you should blame them. No, it's whichever party allows you to blame someone else for your life, you'll choose that one that feels more reasonable to you. That's a biggie. But there's also, and I almost consider these like the good people. You know what I mean? Like, to me, like,
That's right.
like a weak person, who I don't really care for, they blame other people. Almost to me, like, the good people blame themselves. You know what I mean?
That's
and that,
the point.
but there's no more nobility in that in your point in the book either. But I almost, don't you feel that way? Like there's almost like a redemptive social quality almost, or a morality to not blaming others, but blaming yourself. And then you just carry that crap. You carry that crap through your life the rest of your life. I blame myself for the failure of my marriage. I blame myself for the fact that I've gained weight. I blame myself. And there's a difference between blame and ownership and accountability, right? There's a difference there. I'd love for you to talk about that.
Well, the guy who's flying my plane to LA, I want me fly it responsibly rather than he's to blame for it. So there's two different pilots up front when that's happening, right? I want the guy who's just responsible and accountable and owns it and owns all of it, right? And can fly the plane with that ownership. But self-blame is the biggest get out of jail free card you can ever play yourself. And people don't like to hear that one, right? Because it's like, you don't know. It's like, I know I do know. I actually do know. And I want you to understand, like, this is how you get off the hook for being on the hook for living a great life. You get to say, oh, well, I'm still punishing myself. Okay. And anytime somebody gets himself to that point, like, there's one question you have to ask yourself. If you're blaming somebody else, what are you getting out of it?
Yeah.
Just really look, like, what are you getting out of it? And if you're blaming yourself, what are you getting out of it? What does it justify? What does it allow you to perpetuate? What does it allow you to keep doing in the name of what? And you'll see it. Like there's so little introspection with us at times because, I mean, there can be too much introspection. If you're grinding your hole introspectively, then you gotta loosen that up a bit. But there is a balance. There's a nice balance where you can actually start to, look a little bit, learn a little bit, step out into the new with what you've learned. But all too often we're just. I mean, this is why sometimes when I talk to people, they're shocked at what's coming out of my mouth. And I'm like, well, you should be a little more shocked with what's going on in your head than what's coming out of my mouth, because I'm just joining the dots together for you. You're the one who wrote this story.
Yeah, that's why I said when I introduced you, brother, like you don't let them escape themselves. And I think one of the reasons you don't is that you're trying not to escape yourself. And we haven't even talked about parenting yet, although all these things imprint on parenting. And so we ought to jump there for a second on why all this matters. But everybody, if you're now, we're 30% of the way through this interview or 50% of the way through. If you're not doing some of that self-reflection right now, please start. What are some of my patterns? What are some of the meanings I've taken away from my life? To your point, does it serve me to believe these things? Does it serve me to blame this person? Does it serve me to blame myself? Start to live more consciously rather than unconsciously. Start to evaluate and be aware. And the reason that matters as a parent is I often say, Gary, most things with our children are caught, not taught. They're catching things from us all the time. You make the point in the book that we should know, but we just forget all the time. And man, I wish I could get a do-over after reading your book, to be honest with you. But it's how much as a parent you're truly being observed by that child.
Right.
And I just think sometimes we're so busy in our own emotions and stress and making sure they get fed and off to school and they did their homework and these other things that we're not aware of the subtle observances that they're making all the time about us.
Right. That's actually part of the development of a human being. When at the beginning of your life, your very young life, you're a player, you're in it, right? But once you start to hit like 10, 11, 12, there's a shift, and the shift is now I'm watching it. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of in it, but I'm watching it. And I'm watching the players around me more now than I ever watched them before. When you're young, you're just playing with them, right? So you're playing with your parents, you're playing with your brothers and sisters. You start to hit 10, 11, 12, and that's like I'm starting to watch them. And, I say this to people all the time, your children are onto you in the exact same way you were onto your parents. So whatever you started to see, and that's when that, I talk about this in the book, like when this kind of world of cynicism starts to arise, there's a very natural disconnect that has to happen between children and parents. What parents fail to see is it's coming from the children. Like they're disconnecting, and it's done over a period of years, but all it really is there to serve is that it justifies them forging ahead and living their own life. So in many cases, what they have to do is justify that break. So they have to justify that break. And that's another big thing I wanted people to get. Again, looking at maybe back at your own childhood or your own teen years and saying, oh yeah, I did go through something like that, because people think it was circumstantial. People look back and say, well, my father lost his job or my mother lost her job and it was a tough time for the family and this is why this has happened. No, this was happening. Yeah. This was going to happen. You just have to realize that it was going to happen. It might have happened in a volcano or it might have happened very smoothly, but it was going to happen. And it's going to happen with your children. They're going to get through the exact same sort of spaces, the exact same sort of development, and they're literally going to justify not being around you.
You paint three stages in the book, right? There's like 0 to what, 4 or 6, then about to 12. I think it's important that because you know what's in the book and I know what's in the book, but they don't, and I want them to get the book. Right. So I want you, if you don't mind, like paint those 3 stages really quickly. You just sort of describe them around them. Let's go right into them for a minute so that when it's happening with your child, if you are a parent, this is a parent part of the interview for a minute here, what those look like and why they're happening. I think it's really, really important.
Well, again, I take an ontological perspective. Yep. So somebody who's a psychologist might take a different one, but I take an ontological perspective. Although I should add, I was interviewed recently by a psychologist and she felt as if it pretty much lines up with psychology. Good. But anyway, I describe them as 3 waves. I said, life comes at you in 3 waves. And when it comes at you, it changes you. You become changed by that wave. And if you look at it in the beginning, like that first wave is when a child first really sees that they are a self, that they become self-aware. Like they were more out here, if you like, more connected to life before that. Mm-hmm. Suddenly there's a big, massive sea change. Like, and again, I describe it in the book, I say life comes at you like a wave. Mm-hmm. And again, this is why I talk about traumas, because everybody's traumatized, because how could you not be? Could you be born the way you're born and not be like jarred by this world? How could you just be like, nope, it's all good to me?
Right.
How could you not be jarred by it? Of course you're going to be jarred by it. The light, the noise, the sounds, the cultures, the whole deal. Mm-hmm. But that first wave is when you get a sense of a self, and it first really starts to get like, oh, like I'm here now, and the focus becomes on self, right? Mm-hmm. But in those kind of years, and you're in that young adult, as I like to call them, even though they might only be 4 or 5 or 6 or 7, it's actually we're starting to notice like what we're not good at. So it's not even just like the realization of self. That's often the time when people come to realizations like, wow, I'm not as smart as those other kids, or I don't fit in as well as those other kids, or I don't. So we start to become more self-aware, and it kind of leads us naturally into this next phase, because in that next phase, like we're becoming way more observational now, but way more observational of our parents, right? This is really starting to ramp up. So we see our parents do things and then say other things, and then say things and do the opposite. Yeah. And we start to find the little cracks. We start to see these little shifts and changes in them. And it really is when that little empire starts to crumble. because we don't relate to our mom or our dad or whoever's raising us in the same light. We start to see them in a different light. And that's the beginning of the separation or the disconnect. Now, I've worked with parents in the past, and they can actually talk me through, like, I remember when that actually started. I remember the week that started. I remember like they were like this, and then they were like that.
Yep.
And I could never get them back to it. I could never get them back to the way they were. It was like they just stepped over something, like they'd gone over a bridge and there was no going back. And so that next wave is, I call it the wave of cynicism, because it really is where cynicism starts to kick in. And I talk about this in the book too. I want people to get how cynical we are, like that lives on, that same cynicism. But if you understand the development of human beings, to be cynical would be to kind of be active and on your feet and making sure you're never going to get duped and you're never going to get turned over. And, cynicism makes sense for people. People, I know a lot of positive folks are like, I'm not cynical. Positive people tend to be really cynical about negative people, I notice.
So good.
I'm not positive across the board. I'm really positive except to that jerk over there because he's really negative. But anyway, as that bleeds on in that final phase, and in that final phase really is when that justification for separation starts to arise. Like we really start to see, I've had enough of this. It's like that break from the family unit has to happen. And again, sometimes those can happen inside of a massive upset. Sometimes those can happen very, very smoothly. But be left in no doubt, I had that realization myself when I was deep into my 30s, when I suddenly realized the 3,000-mile difference between myself and my mother was in fact not an accident nor circumstantial.
You're making me literally think about my relationship with my parents when I went through those stages, and I can definitively see it with my own children. I mean, and your point in the book is those are natural stages. I've been saying lately in some of my speeches, though, as a parent, that I think one of the most insidious forms of child neglect going on in the world is a child being raised by a parent who is either not becoming more aware of their own patterns, pursuing their potential or their dreams. It's one thing because we all figure our parents out, to your point. At some age, I figured out who my dad was and who my mom was. And it's one thing to say, sweetheart, you can be happy and have an amazing life. At some point, your child's going to look at you and go, then why aren't you, mama? Son, you can be president and walk in a room and make a difference in the world. Well, why aren't you, Dad? At some point, there's an incongruency. And I don't think our children care about how much money we have, but I do think they want our parents to be happy and blissful and peaceful and joyous. And your kids know you. They see how you look at yourself in the rearview mirror when you're driving them to school every day, not the face you put on when you get out of the car and walk into the office. They know, and they pick up those emotions. I don't think you always inherit all of your parents' emotional or their behaviors and everything, but I do think you pick up some of their emotional imprinting, and that's so important because in your work, you talk about at the end of the day, if I'm a parent, what do I want my kid to leave my house with? And you name a couple things in the book, but what do you feel like if I'm a parent and you were my son, by the time you leave me, what should I want you leaving me with?
The ability to love another. Wow. You can't love another, you're screwed in this world. So you have to know how to love another, and you have to know what that looks like. You have to know what that feels like. You have to have experienced that for yourself. And that's one of those things that your children are going to observe. They're going to watch how their dad did it or their mom did it. Like, how did they love another? And not how they loved them. How did they love another? And so those are the moments where, as somebody's getting a little bit older, they're either going to replicate the way that their father loved, or they're going to try and do something that's the opposite of that. So love is fundamental, right? I mean, I know we want them to have tips and tricks and hacks and stuff they can use in life. Listen, if they know how to love another, that'll go a long way to a happy life.
What a great answer.
The second thing that I get into is forgiveness, because, there's a whole part in the book about forgiveness and why it doesn't work.
Right.
But when you take out blame, forgiveness is easy. What does forgiveness give me? It gives me the ability to move on. Forgiveness gives me the ability to pivot and move. And I would say that for me as a human being, I would say that's one of my superpowers. Now, forgiveness does not mean, yeah, you can just go ahead and do that again. No, sometimes it changes things, but I'm not going to hang on to it. Why? I don't have time. So I want my children to have that kind of freedom. I want them to see me forgiving another. I forgive them. It's okay. Because I know that in the next moment, I have the power to make change. But if I don't forgive, the only real change I can make is based on that lack of forgiveness. So that's like a grind. That's a negative energy. That's a lot of down-driven, like that kind of energy. So forgiveness, freedom to pivot, move on, be powerful. And another big thing, I talk about authenticity in the book, but what I wanted people to get at the end of this was this thing called integrity. Yeah. I wanted people to understand what integrity is. It's not morality. It is not like doing the right thing or something. That's not integrity, right? Why not? Because doing the right thing is subjective. Sure is. So it's based on some code of morality or values. It's got nothing to do with integrity. In fact, if you have no integrity, but you're up to here with morality, your morality is not worth anything anyway, because there's nothing holding it together. Integrity is what holds morality together. Morality without integrity is useless. Values without integrity is useless. Integrity exists on its own. So what's integrity for us? It's teaching yourself to honor yourself, to treat what you say and what you do like it actually matters, and to demonstrate that to your children. To say, you know what, I said I was going to do that, and I'm going to do it. And so it's not always saying to your children, you said you would do it, so you do it. It's that I said I would do it, and I'm going to do it. And I don't feel like doing it, but I'm going to do it. Why? Because I told myself I would, and that matters. And so if your children can pick that up, if your children can have the ability to love, if your children have the ability to forgive and pivot and move, and if your children have the ability to no longer honor their negative feelings, to actually stay true to something else called their personal integrity, I would say they're pretty much equipped for anything that life might throw at them.
Bro, this is so freaking good. I look how your work, just so you know, you're about to be blown away by how familiar I am with your work, but all of your work flows together from your first book to this book. Because on the integrity line, I have this written in my office, just so you know. I think this is out of Un-F Yourself. I'm not positive. But you said, thoughts don't define you, actions do. And these are things that I think, is it from that book?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the same
point.
I mean,
sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, please.
Well, I mean, I'm not saying something radically, wildly new. Like, I mean, the Stoics were saying, 2,000 years ago. But I wrote a book called Love Unearthed, okay?
Yep.
And I talked about why marriage is screwed. And marriage is screwed because it's based on this thing called a vow. So I declare my vows, and my partner will declare their vows. And that's the thing. Why we're screwed in that whole ceremony, it doesn't actually mean anything anymore, is because a vow isn't a thing in society anymore. So 1,000 years ago, a vow was a big deal. So what was a vow? A vow was a contract that you made in language. So like a solemn promise. And so when people used to stand up and say, I promise to love and honor and cherish you, you are saying that to a community of people. They're now expecting you to live by your word, right? We don't live that way anymore. We don't live by our word. What do we live by? How we feel. And what's the problem in that? How we feel is always based in the past. So if I keep going by that's why I don't subscribe to all this. Did you go with your gut? I'm like, I hope not, because I could change that with pizza. So my whole approach is, what'll keep you true is what exists outside of you. If you can honor something that's outside of you, something that compels you, something that's greater than the sum of these parts, then you'll learn the ability to go beyond self. And beyond self is beyond fear, is beyond the past, is beyond self-imposed limitations, is beyond self-limiting beliefs, is beyond all of those things. And then you're playing this game of like, what do I need to get out of the way to make sure I deliver? And to me, that's power.
Bro, that is unbelievably well said. I don't want to stop. We're going to go 10 more minutes. Sorry. It's too good. It's too damn good. Because I want all your work to be merged together. I actually say a lot of times, I think the quality of your life is in direct proportion to your ability to embrace and deal with uncertainty. And one of the other things we do, I think, you tell me, you in NF Yourself, you said, make friends with uncertainty. And I think it's from that book. And
Right.
One of the reasons I think we establish these stories in our life is they're predictable and certain. And I wrote a book last year, and a lot of that book was about my dad's alcoholism. And by the way, I agree with you on that label. It's one of the things I have a challenge with, and even in AA is, and my dad was in AA and it worked for him, but is this label of that term and that identity. But having said all that, that's a whole other conversation. I found myself after a while on that book tour not enjoying talking about it. And it was just like, because it's not real. I did it for the purposes of helping other people. But the truth is, many, many years ago, I stopped telling that story. And I think that's why I've had a somewhat relatively productive and somewhat happy life, is like, I'm not addicted to the certainty and the predictability of my stories. And even as a guy who, like, I don't know that I'm naturally a big risk taker, because I grew up with so much risk around me. I think there's this little bit of me that's like tries to avoid that. But as I've embraced more uncertainty in my life, it's actually helped me accept that's what life is. Let me give an example and I'll let you respond. As we're recording this 2 days ago, I had a lady on my show who's one of my dear friends just a few weeks ago who had stage 4 colon cancer. She's 34 years old. And she passed away 2 days ago. And there's no way a year ago you could have told her that in any way, shape, or form that was going to be a part of her life. But it was. Life is uncertain. And I think our false notion that I'm going to be able to control everything in my life and that it's predictable and certain. And if I tell myself these stories over and over again, if I stay safe and don't take risks and don't get vulnerable or authentic with people, if I just stay in this space, I'll have certainty. And I think certainty is like the greatest lie of our lives. Nothing is certain, and it's a fallacy that you think you're embracing it anyway. So to step into the uncertain, to me, is to actually step into life in general. Do you agree with that? And what's your version of what I just said?
Well, I mean, you're right there. You're right. You're right there. I mean, there is no certainty. It doesn't exist. It's a human construct. Right? We're just trying to make it certain. So when people say, step into the uncertainty, okay, that's fine to say that, but you need to realize you're in the uncertainty. You don't have to step, you're in it. What we're doing is trying to make sense of it because we feel as if, look, we are, and I did talk about this in the first book, like we're consumed by protecting. So we want to predict the weather. Want to predict the financial markets. We want to predict our relationship. We want to predict the lives of our children, right? We're literally looking at our child make a mistake, and we're already like seeing that taking them straight to the state penitentiary by the time they're 18, right? We're already seeing a straight line between like bunking off at school one day when they were 12 and like, oh, you're going to the state pen. We're already predicting futures, and we're predicting futures based on the past. So this is why when I talk to people, I say, look, you don't live like anything's possible. You live like some things are possible given what I know. Wow. And that's kind of like the blinkered view that we have. But the alternative to that is to expose yourself to the chaos, right? And the unpredictability of uncertainty. And this is what I wanted people to get grounded in that book. And when I wrote Wise AF a bit later, I wanted people to get, you thrive in that environment. You're brilliant in unpredictability. You're actually creative and masterful in unpredictability. How do I know that? Look back in your life. Look at those moments when you get sideswiped and look what you did. Look how you responded. Look what you created. Look how you stepped up. People do their best thinking in uncertainty. People do their most inventive and creative work in uncertainty. And in predictability, they just get grounded out in the repetitive patterns. That's why I say people would rather have the misery of a predictable life than he actually wake up to the idea that they could have way more than that. But then they're faced with, well, what about this and what about that? And then I'd have to deal with this. And I'm like, yeah, but that's the game. So to me, it's more like exposing yourself to how unpredictable it is and then giving yourself the freedom to go perform there.
So good. Brother, I'm just enjoying this so much. Gosh, man, there's been several moments this interview. It's like I wish I could just go rewind and hear you say that again, and then talk a little bit more about it. Let me ask you one more thing, if I could. And again, I've never had someone's work. I think that I wrote down more of what they said than the way you write and express yourself. So the last thing, like this is just like life advice, but it's also in a parenting book too. It's both. It's in a parenting book and a life book. You said, man, and I need to do a better job of this when I read this to you. I do. You said, speak like your words mean everything. Listen without making it mean anything. What do you mean when you say that? Like, what great life advice? I know what it means to me when I read it, but what did it mean to you when you wrote it?
There's a big, look, cultures develop and continue to develop in the articulation of new conversations. So if you want to know how a society changes, what changes is what they talk about, right? So if you go back through time, you'll see societies talking about new things. And as they talk about those new things, they're literally having to give new language to some of those new things, because it's not like those things didn't exist before. We just had no language for that, right? So we had no language for it. So in society now, there's a lot of talk about how you speak, what you're saying, when you're saying it, right? People are going on, they're calling it political correctness. Okay, fine, but that's an articulation of a language that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago, okay? So language is evolving, and as that language and those conversations are evolving, society is evolving. But all we want to talk about is what people are saying. And they're asking people to be responsible for what they're saying. And I say, great, I think that's fair enough. But you need to be responsible for the way in which you listen. You need to be responsible for the way things are landing for you. And rather than putting that on somebody else, you might want to do a little bit of work on yourself and realize, like, hey, this is an old thing for me that's coming up. This person's talking, saying whatever they want to say, and I'm getting hooked. And I'm getting hooked by something of my own making. But we don't. We are all too often. And it's two ways. It's not one or the other. It's both. Can I be responsible for the way that this might land? But at the same time, can I be responsible for what I'm listening to? And am I making sure that this goes in the right spot, right? Rather than just hooked by an old trigger or pattern from my own past.
That should be played on like every nightly news broadcast for the next 16 years, every single damn night, what you just said right there. I just want to first say something to you. Thank you for this today, and thank you for your work. It's improved my life, Gary. Your work has improved my life. Thank you.
Right.
And today's conversation, bro, is one for the ages. Look, I've done a lot of these, okay? A lot of them. This is one for the ages, and I'm extremely grateful to have been a part of it. And you have an open invite. The only thing is you need to sit in front of me next time. We're not doing this Zoom crap again. We're going to be together. Is that fair?
For sure. I'll do it. I'll definitely do it.
I would love that. And everybody, listen, grow up, becoming the parent your kids deserve. In fact, let me just say this to you. If he wrote it, get it. If you wrote it, get it. You've never heard me quote more lines from any person's book ever on the show because I write them down and I keep them. And I'll keep this conversation close to my heart and my mind for a long time too, Gary. So thank you again, bro. Very, very much.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Everybody go grab The Power of One More, my book as well, while you're grabbing his. And at the same time, share this episode. I probably don't even need to ask you to do that today. I'm pretty sure you're sharing it. So anybody you care about, anybody's life you want to make better, anybody you want to make a better parent or a better human being, whether they have kids or not, they need to hear this show today. All right, everybody, God bless you. Max out your life.